This retaining ring acts as a stop for the fan side armature bearing. The retaining ring is attached to the armature, and then the bearing is pressed up against it. Typically, this retaining ring will only need to be replaced when servicing the armature bearings. It is a good idea to replace a retaining ring anytime it is removed to ensure that it fits snugly and properly. Replacing the retaining ring is a repair that you can do yourself, and I'm going to show you how.
Hi, I'm Mark Socha.
Do-it-yourself repairs like these are easier than you might think. From lawn machines to cordless drills, kitchen mixers,
Outdoor grills.
our how-to videos walk you through each repair from start to finish. So doing it yourself means never having to do it alone.
Let's get started.
I'll begin by removing the motor end cover. It's held in place with a couple of screws. Next, I'll remove the brush caps and the brushes. Next, I'll remove the top half of the handle cover. To be able to remove the motor housing in the field, I'll need some slack in the wires that go between the switch and the field. To get that slack, I'll remove the switch, and now I'll have enough wire that I'll be able to pull this free. The motor assembly is held to the rest of the saw with 4 screws. I'll go ahead and remove those screws now and pull the motor away from the saw. There's a rubber cup around the rear armature bearing, and at this point the friction from that cup is the only thing holding the armature inside the rest of the motor. So I'll use a screwdriver and push on the rear of the armature through the back of the housing to push the armature out. Removing the fan side armature bearing can be a little tricky because the gap between the fan and the bearing is very small. It's not really practical to use a bearing puller because most pullers won't fit in that small space. I found the best way to do it is to use a bearing separator. You'll need one that's flush on the back so it'll fit in that small gap between the bearing and the fan. I'll place the separator over the bearing and tighten it up. The next challenge is I have very little space between the separator and the fan. So I need to support the bearing separator on the jaws of my vise on just a very small contact point. Again, I want to be careful not to damage the fan as I mount it into the vise. That's about as tight as I can close the vise jaws. Now I'll use a rubber mallet to strike the end of the armature and tap the armature away from the bearing. I'll have to stop once or twice during this process to tighten up the bearing separator. With the bearing removed, now we have access to the retaining ring. I'll use a pair of retaining ring pliers to remove it. Now I can install the new retaining ring. I'll open it no more than I have to just slide it over the armature shaft and seat it down in the groove. Now install the new armature bearing. I'll place the bearing over the end of the armature shaft, and I'll use a socket that has a diameter about the same size as the inner race on the bearing. It also needs to have a large enough inner diameter that it'll fit over the armature shaft. Now the best way to seat the bearing would be to use a bearing press, but most people don't have one of those. So again, I'll just use my rubber mallet and carefully tap the bearing onto the shaft until it seats against the retaining ring. Now we can put the motor back together. I find it's easiest to install the armature back onto the saw first and then slide the motor cover and field over the armature. And then get the gears to engage and press the bearing into the housing. Like that. Now I can slide the motor housing and the field over the armature. Before I do, I want to make sure that this rubber boot is still on the rear bearing and not down in the housing. If it's stuck in the housing, remove it and put it back onto the bearing. So I'll just slide this together, pulling the slack back out of the wires as I slide it onto the armature. And then I want to make sure that the boot presses into the housing. Now I'll secure the motor housing to the rest of the saw with the 4 screws. I like to start the screws with a screwdriver to make sure that they line up and don't strip, and then I'll finish them up with an impact driver. Now I can reinstall the switch and route the wires. I'll start with these wires up near the switch, get them down into the holders. Now I can secure the switch. You'll notice that there's 2 holes. For this internal screw, you'll want to use the hole closest to the switch body. The other hole is used by a screw that comes through the handle. And now I'll just tuck away the rest of the wires. Now reinstall the handle cover and secure it with the screws. Now I'll reinstall the motor brushes and the brush caps. And I'll finish up by reinstalling the motor end cover and securing it with the screws. Be sure to check back often for new videos and expert advice. If you found this video helpful, give us a thumbs up.
And leave a comment.